to Saird's Audio Fanfictions. I'm Saird. Thanks for tuning in. The following is the first 15 minutes of my new audio fic, Vox Corporis, by MissAnnThropic. This is just a small snippet of the first chapter. The full and following chapters can be accessed by subscribing to my Patreon with the links below. Unfortunately, the full fic won't be available on my website, AO3 profile page, or SAF's public podcast until the fic's completion. So be sure to hit that alert and subscribe button to be the first to know as soon as it goes live. Right, with all that out of the way, let's get to it. Happy listening. Chapter 1. Things were in a state of near total chaos in Mad-Eye Moody's office. Apparently, discovering an escaped prisoner of Azkaban and loyal servant to Lord Voldemort, who had gone through a recent rebirth, in their midst, assisting the real Moody, who'd been trapped in a chest for months without reprieve, handling the death of a Hogwarts student, juggling the visiting schools and officials for the Triwizard Tournament, and intercepting and placating a suddenly nosy Ministry of Magic, was enough for anyone to get lost in the shuffle. Even a boy like Harry Potter. After Crouch Jr. had been unmasked for the imposter he was, Dumbledore had herded Harry into the anteroom of the office when the Minister of Magic had caught up to Hogwarts' head wizard and demanded to know why a young boy's body was being transported home for burial. Dumbledore had gently led Harry aside and, with a pat on the arm, left him there to tend to the unpleasantries of a student death, mostly out of earshot of the traumatized boy. Tending to a few details had become entanglement in 1,001 knots, and everyone was so busy and confused that no one noticed eerily quiet Harry on the outskirts. Harry watched the heads of magic, both in the Ministry and Hogwarts, pass in and out of his line of sight. They moved hurriedly, but with a strange flatness. They were like puppets or paper dolls, insubstantial and somehow unreal. They moved and talked and gesticulated and congregated, but Harry saw only vague blurs of human shapes. It was like he wasn't wearing his glasses. He couldn't focus on any one person. He just let them flow in and out of his sight. No effort to catch and hold on a single object. No attention to the faces or shapes. Just images, flowing past, coming in and vanishing. His arm hurt. The lancing pain had given way to a throbbing, fiery sensation. He knew his arm hurt. Part of him felt it. But even his own injury seemed disconnected. He cradled his wounded arm, but it seemed autonomic, pre-programmed and stilted. There was a blackness in his blood. He felt a thick, dark weight pushing through him with every hollow heartbeat. It pounded in his temples, ached in his forehead, sludged with freezing tendrils to his limbs and skin. With each passing moment, he felt less and less. The pain wasn't searing anymore. The terror ebbed. Even the grief thinned, and left very little person in its wake when all the substance of him was stretched so far. He existed because laws said he did. But Harry watched his teachers bustle about and thought maybe he was a ghost. His mind played tricks, and maybe he wasn't really there. Maybe he'd died in that graveyard. Maybe he was a ghost, like Cedric, like his parents. Maybe he was dead and didn't know it. He certainly felt more like a ghost than a person. An odd peace, a stillness, settled around him with that thought. Yes, dead, where there was no pain, no fear, no self. He could be that. Maybe he'd disappear at any moment. No one seemed to see him. He could be dead. He should be floating, but for the thick evil in his blood, bound to a demon and thrumming with a darkness he didn't own. It was in him, like a disease, a possession. Black, thick, and oily instead of smooth, watery red. He would be a ghost, but for that heaviness in his veins. Death was cold. He was certainly that. One of the few sensations that did register. A sense that permeated his non-existence to hint of physical form, was cold. The room got colder and colder as time trudged on. He couldn't move to ward it off. His body wouldn't let him find someplace warm. But he felt it, like the icy air when dementors swarmed. He shouldn't know that. He was just a boy. A boy with demon blood. Vaguely, distantly, he knew his body was trembling. It tightened painfully in his arm, made his insides ache and his brain pulse against his skull. But it wasn't enough for him to do anything about it. He wouldn't move for that. Couldn't. His blood roared in his ears, an increasing tempo of whoosh, whoosh, that grew louder, filled his senses. And then he heard nothing of the conversation flying around him. He saw lips moving, hands gesturing, but as for sound, comprehension, it was out of his grasp. They weren't making sense. They were on another plane, in a dream, hazy and illusory. He thought he was colder. He thought his arm hurt. It was hard to think, but then ghosts with evil blood didn't have to think. They were, and Harry only was, in his corner, invisible, unnoticed. And so cold. McGonagall stepped back from the ministry attendant as they finally came to collect Crouch Jr. She could not be far enough away from the man. He'd go back to Azkaban where he belonged, and if there was any justice, he'd suffer the most hideous punishment for what he had done. The full scope of what exactly he'd done, and the activities to which he was party, however, were still a little uncertain. Things were in upheaval. Dumbledore had gone to speak with the heads of the other schools. They demanded to know what had happened in the maze. No one knew. There were pieces, speculations, assumptions, but so much was still unknown. So very dreadful that a student had died. And Voldemort. If it were true, then Hogwarts was bound to see dark times ahead, especially with Harry. McGonagall quickly scanned the room, almost frantically, when she suddenly remembered the boy. Surely he'd been taken away from the center of all this ugliness, but she couldn't remember seeing anyone leave with him. She was aghast to see him still in the room, standing unsteadily by a far wall. His clothes were in tatters, dirty and torn, and his skin was molted with grime and blood. He was loosely holding his bloody arm to his body, and his eyes were locked and unfocused on a distant, unseen point. His skin was pale, and his eyes terrifyingly empty. He looked so small. She had told Dumbledore it was a mistake to let Potter compete in the tournament. Just a boy, a mere boy. How had they allowed it to come to this? McGonagall moved quickly across the room and only slowed when she was 2 steps from Harry. "Mr. Potter," she ventured gently, and canted her head to try and meet his gaze. Harry didn't respond to her voice or presence. He continued to stare vacantly and absently cradle his arm. McGonagall drew closer and soon realized Harry was shaking, his breathing shallow and irregular. "Mr. Potter," she tried again, and reached out to touch him. Her fingers curled softly around his shoulder, and Harry swayed drunkenly under her hand. Moody's room had quickly cleared. Only Snape remained behind, rummaging through Moody's belongings, looking for anything that might be tied to the Dark Lord and Crouch Jr.'s handiwork. "Harry?" McGonagall said, this time in concern. Harry wasn't answering. He wasn't listening. And he was so pale, his skin frighteningly cold to the touch, his entire frame trembling. Snape, hearing McGonagall's tone, paused to look over his shoulder in their direction in mild curiosity. McGonagall gasped and quickly wrapped her arms around Harry's shoulders when, without warning, he started to fall. "Severus!" she called reflexively, and Snape reached their side in 2 strides. Harry was leaning heavily into McGonagall, still feebly cradling his arm, still staring sightlessly, still shaking. Harry's legs started to fold under him. McGonagall gave a pitiful sound, and Snape reached out and gripped Harry's upper arm in a firm fist. In the next moment, it wasn't enough when Harry's legs buckled and he started to fall. In one movement, Snape scooped the boy up and presently stood with Harry in his arms. McGonagall's hand came to her mouth, and Snape held the boy's limp body away from him like it was a wet raccoon. Harry's head lolled, and his arms simply folded atop his stomach. "Quickly, we must get him to the hospital wing," McGonagall said, and Snape gave one appraising look at Harry in his hold, and had to agree with McGonagall. Hermione scarcely dared to breathe. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribcage and her muscles tensed to the point of shaking. Ron's body pressed so closely to hers made it uncomfortably hot under the cloak. But Hermione barely noticed him. Ron was just as silent as she, and probably just as terrified. From the look on his face, before they'd nicked Harry's cloak from his chest, she considered herself lucky that he wasn't vomiting down the back of her neck. As for herself, she was holding her breathing so strictly in check because she feared any exhale would come out a sob. They must not be heard. She and Ron were crouched by the far wall of the hospital wing, waiting. After Harry returned to the arena with Cedric's body, there had been shocked stillness, numb inactivity. Hermione noted only that Cedric was dead. Harry had been led away in a bad state. Cedric was dead. People were crying. Cedric was dead. When the remaining professors snapped out of the mass stupor, they ordered the prefects to herd the students back to the castle. It was then Hermione started thinking straight. Harry was missing. They had to find Harry. From the glimpses of blood, from his wails, she was certain he'd been taken to the hospital wing. She'd grabbed Ron's arm, dragged him unflinchingly up the boys' staircase, fetched Harry's invisibility cloak, and with it masking their passage, they made their way to the hospital wing. They would not be stopped. Hermione would not be stopped. They had to see Harry. They arrived, however, to find the room empty. No Harry, no Pomfrey, just silence. It was baffling. It made no sense. But Hermione shuffled herself and Ron to a wall out of the way of traffic, and they silently waited. Harry would be brought here. Hermione wouldn't let go of that certainty. She had to see Harry, had to know that he was okay, that one student had returned dead, but Harry was all right. It seemed they waited a small infinity before the doors opened and the empty room was suddenly inundated. Hermione's heart leapt into her throat and her knees threatened to fold under her. She heard Ron abruptly stop breathing beside her at the same sight that had made Hermione feel decidedly unsteady. Dumbledore led the procession, followed quickly by McGonagall. Both turned to look back at Professor Snape. Snape was carrying Harry's limp form. Hermione grimaced and bit her lip, wanting to scream. No! She wanted to rush from the cloak's safety, run to Snape and snatch Harry from the teacher's hold. Harry wouldn't wake up for him. Harry hated Snape. But she and Ron could wake him. She was sure of it. They were his best friends. He'd wake for them well before he would ever wake for Snape. She knew Harry would. More times than she could count, she'd convinced Harry to do something on her urging. She knew how to win Harry's will, and that was no small feat to boast. She could make him wake up. Harry would listen to her. He had to. He absolutely could not be dead. Snape looked rather put out, having to carry his despised student. But he obeyed Pomfrey's commands as she trotted after Snape and bade him lay the boy gently on a bed. Gently. One wouldn't gently lay a corpse. He had to be alive. Hermione's hands clutched the cloak savagely, and her heart tried to tear at the seams under the stress of not knowing. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. This has been the first 15 minutes of Chapter 1 of Vox Corporis. The full chapter, as well as following chapters, will be posted monthly on my Patreon. Be sure to like, subscribe, and follow for future chapters, fics, and updates. Until next time, happy listening.